Welcome, Brian. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Jo. Great to be here.
How are you? How has this crazy pandemic been for you?
Well, I think like everybody, it's been a difficult, trying time, but at least it seems possible that the end is near. You know, I'm isolated in upstate New York. In fact, as I mentioned before, we lost our electric power last night in a tremendous windstorm out here in the middle of nowhere. So I've migrated to a friend's office here, also in the middle of nowhere, and hopefully the connection will be stable.
Yeah, let's hope so. And yeah, there's definitely a feeling of hope and maybe even spring in the air. So yeah, your book, Brian, it's beautifully written and beautifully crafted. I love how you use the structure of it to tell that whole story of the cosmos, starting with the deep physical principles that make order and complexity possible in the universe. And then you've got this brief flowering of life, consciousness, human achievements, beliefs, art, and then you look forward to this long future of the universe, and it gets quite bleak with the death of literally everything, but you find meaning there too. So I'm hoping that in our conversation we can kind of trace that same journey. But first, I wanted to ask you, why did you want to write this book? Because previously, you know, you've written about physics in your books, about string theory, multiple universes, the nature of space and time. But this is much, much bigger. I mean, you've got not just physics, but you've wrapped in life, meaning, art, basically all of existence. So what motivated you to write this, to take this approach, and what were you hoping to achieve with the book?
Well, some would say it's because I'm getting old. That may be the quickest answer. But the real answer is, you know, my other books were all about explaining cutting edge ideas, whether it was string theory or general relativity or things of that sort, quantum mechanics, quantum field theory, trying to explain those ideas to a general audience. So it was really all about comprehension of the forefront of science. But the thing is, even though I've been fortunate to at times be at the forefront of science, that to me is not the be all and end all of why I do what I do. The reason I have been drawn to science is because it helps illuminate the real big questions that we as a species have been asking since the first member of our clan looked skyward and tried to make sense of it all. And so this book really, in some sense, has been growing within me for the past 30, 40 years as a professional scientist, where the work that I do in science has helped inform my sense of who we are, how we got here, where it's heading, and what it might all mean. And in this book, I tried to set down my thoughts on those big questions.
And you mentioned at the beginning of the book the theme of mortality and this human fear of death that we have, and that as a motivation for a lot of what we do. Would you be able to say a little bit about that and how that fed into the book?
Yeah, certainly. Back, I think it was the 1980s, although I could be getting my decades wrong, I encountered a book by Ernest Becker. He won the Pulitzer Prize in the United States for this book. It is not widely read today for whatever reason. I don't know why. When I talk to students at Columbia, they've never heard of that book, but it had a deep influence on me. And what Becker did in that book was develop ideas that had really gone back to some of the early psychoanalysis, you know, Otto Rank, people of that sort, who wondered and put forward an argument to the effect that the reason why we do what we do is we are really the sole species that has full cognizance of our own mortality. And that recognition drives us to try to deny our own mortality, to deny our finite lives. And we do that in a whole host of different ways. Some soothe that kind of existential yearning by commitment to a family or a religion or a movement, or some leave behind creative artifacts that extend their presence, albeit in a symbolic way. And that had a deep influence upon me because I began to realize that I was drawn to physics for exactly the same reason. Physics is that subject which allows us to say sensible things about the very far future. We can actually glean what it will be like any number of millennia into the future with a modest set of assumptions. And that sense of connection to eternity was really what I realized was driving me, and it resonated with what Becker was articulating in that book.
Yeah, it's wonderful how you link that theme of mortality from the individual through to the universe. And you take you have a reductionist approach. You talk about how you see everything in the universe as being composed of particles and forces. But what's really interesting about it is how you then layer on top of that these other kinds of stories. So how did you go about doing that?
Yeah, I mean, reductionism in some circles has a very bad name, a bad reputation. It's sort of the flat-footed scientist approach to the world. If you imagine that everything is somehow reducible to its particulate ingredients and the fundamental laws that govern how those particulate ingredients behave. And I feel strongly that the reason why reductionism has gotten a really negative reputation is because oftentimes it has been articulated as an end unto itself, as if once you tell the reductionist account, you're done. And that I don't subscribe to at all. I do subscribe fully to the view that at rock bottom, reality is made of fundamental ingredients governed by fundamental laws, but you need to take that as the starting point for a synthesis where you then build the chemist story upon that, you build the biologist story upon that, and you keep going up layer upon layer of complexity and nuance. You get to the philosopher's account, the neuroscientist account, the poet's account, the novelist's account. All of these accounts matter. They deeply matter. They are as important as the reductionist account because they illuminate different questions, different concerns, which are vital to why we identify as human beings and what it means to be a human being. So the reductionist account is vital. It sets the rock bottom foundation. And then, as I do in the book, and as many thinkers across millennia have done, I try to layer upon that reductionist account the other stories that ultimately lead to, I think, a deeper understanding of things that matter to us, questions of value and meaning and purpose.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get to those other stories, I hope, but let's start then at the beginning with the early universe. And you talk about two organizing principles, entropy and evolution, which help to bring order and complexity in the universe. So entropy comes into play first. And this is, it's a popular concept, but it's quite a tricky one. So can you say a little bit about what entropy is and why is it important to understand entropy for sort of understanding why the universe is how it is?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, in telling a big story, from the beginning of time until the end, you need organizing principles, or else it just becomes a large collection of ideas that don't really piece together in a satisfying manner. And the organizing principles that I find most useful for understanding that account are the ones that you mentioned, entropy and evolution. Entropy, as you also know, Jo, is a very subtle idea. We do have a rigorous mathematical articulation of what entropy is, but for much of what I describe in the book, the more rough and poetic description is pretty good. Entropy is a measure of the amount of disorder in a physical system. Now, that in of itself is a strange idea. How do you go about measuring disorder in any kind of physical system? And the answer, which comes to us from years of study, is that there is a natural mathematical way of counting the number of rearrangements of the constituents in a system. A highly ordered system, you can't rearrange the constituents without changing it. A very messy system, like a child's bedroom, is the canonical example that we love to use. If it's messy and you go in there and you rearrange all the books and games and toys, it'll still look messy. It will not have changed at all. You won't even notice that the rearrangement took place. So if there are many rearrangements that go unnoticed, that's a very disordered system. Very few go unnoticed. That's a highly ordered system. And it turns out that nature tends to go from order toward disorder for the very simple reason that there's so many ways that you can be disordered, so few ways to be ordered. So left to its own devices, the system will tend to find itself in one of the disordered configurations. And that is a pattern that we find not just in kids' bedrooms, but we find this playing out all across the cosmos.
You use quite a nice example of 100 pennies.
Yeah.
And so if they're all tailed up and then you reshuffle them, you're much more likely to get a 50-50 or closer to that. You're unlikely to go back the other way.
Right.
Yeah.
That is the second law of thermodynamics in action. We tend to go from order to disorder, and with the pennies, an ordered configuration, as you know, would say be all tails up. A disordered configuration is a random mixture of heads and tails. And we all know that you start mixing a collection of pennies and they will migrate toward that 50-50 mixture of up and down heads and tails.
So we can apply that to the universe and say that we've got this sort of inexorable increase in entropy as the universe evolves. So how do we get order and structure in the universe?
Yeah, that's a deep question. And I don't know that we fully know the answer to that question as yet. But I think we understand ingredients, vital ingredients in that answer. And there are two that are worth having in mind. The first is, we believe from our studies of the Big Bang and cosmology and inflationary theory, we believe that the early universe was a highly ordered state, a very low entropy state. And so much of the order that we see in the world around us is a remnant of that orderly beginning. Now you could say, okay, why was it so ordered back at the Big Bang? Answer, I don't know. Nobody does. But as far as we can tell, both through our mathematical investigations and our observations, the Big Bang was a highly ordered environment. The second ingredient is that there are natural processes which can yield an overall net increase in entropy, increase in disorder, while at the same time creating little wonderful pockets of order. And I call this the Entropic TwoStep in the book. It's not a term that many physicists use, but for instance, the force of gravity can take a random mixture of particles and cause them all, if there are enough particles, to fall in on themselves and build an orderly star. How is that compatible with the drive toward disorder? Well, in the formation of the star, a lot of heat and light is emitted to the wider environment, causing the overall disorder of the world to go up, even though we get a nice pocket of order in the process. So that entropic two-step, that entropy can go down here so long as it goes up here, that is another fundamental reason that we can get orderly structures in a universe that in aggregate is headed toward ever greater disorder.
So I love this. It's like a loophole. You can't keep complexity down. It's going to find a way to pop up. So that's giving us the stars. So, we don't need to look for an intelligent designer to explain the starry sky. We've got this entropic two-step, which is allowing these structures to arise and to evolve. And so,
actually, let me jump in there just one point, because that's a very good way of putting it, because normally, when we encounter orderly structures in the environment, we immediately say some intelligence must have been involved.
Yep.
Right? You look at a building, you see a book, you see any kind of orderly structure, you say, somebody's been here. Somebody built that.
Yeah. If you see,
and yet we see these orderly structures. Yeah, we see these orderly structures in space, and some, of course, say the same thing. There must have been a guiding intelligence, a higher intelligence. Who knows? Maybe they're right, but we don't need it, because the laws of physics and gravity allow those orderly structures to form without any guidance from the outside.
Yeah. And so we've got the stars, and then we're burning chemical or creating chemical elements in the stars. You go through that in the book. So these ingredients that we're going to need for life. So that's kind of the next step then that you talk about, is the emergence of life. Could you just take us through, what do we know about how do we get from, non-life to life?
Yeah, so again, it's an incomplete story. Biologists the world over and generations have been struggling to give a full account of how inanimate matter can ultimately yield living systems. So unfortunately, we can't sit here and give the full account, but a vital part of that account fits into exactly the concepts that we have been talking about, because the fact that you can build orderly structures, even though the amount of disorder is going up, that allows orderly structures like molecules to form and collections of molecules to form. And There's a version of evolution by natural selection, which is what most of us learn in school when we talk about living systems and how they develop over time. But there's a version of evolution by natural selection that takes place even before any living systems have emerged on planet Earth. There's a version that takes place at the level of molecules. Once a molecule learns the trick of making a copy of itself, of replicating itself, then those molecules that can copy themselves faster, swifter, with greater economy, greater stability, those molecules are going to come to dominate the environment. They're going to be the most fit molecules. And in the process of making copies, we know that no copying process is ever 100% accurate. Sooner or later, there are going to be errors or mutations. And if a mutated molecule is even better at making copies of itself, then it will come to dominate the environment. And if that molecule can make copies not just of itself, but collections of copies of itself, we therefore see a process where, again, with no guiding intelligence, molecules can become ever better at making copies, ever more refined at making versions of themselves and collections of themselves. And in that way, we can ultimately at least envision a process whereby the molecules necessary for living systems can coalesce from this primordial collection of particles simply by virtue of this entropic two-step, allowing orderly things to form, and this molecular version of Darwinian ideas, chemical combat, if you will, with the winners being those molecules that are best fit, ultimately yielding the molecules that are necessary for life.
So now, yes, we've got this second organizing principle, this second way to get that order and complexity into reality, I guess. Yeah. But entropy is still important for us as living creatures. We're still, can you talk a little bit about how we're still kind of living that loophole, if you like?
Well, I'd like to think and like to say that, I'm not sure I like to think it, maybe say it is better, that we are very much like the steam engine, right? I mean, the steam engine was this technological marvel a few hundred years ago. And when folks were studying the steam engine, they worried about the fact that you burn fuel to cause steam in a canister to expand and for a piston to go up and down and do useful work, right? That's what a steam engine is. But the scientists in those early days realized that the steam engine was always wasting some of the fuel by emitting heat directly to the environment. And they wondered if they could maybe make a steam engine that wouldn't do that. And sooner or later, they realized that you can't avoid the waste heat because the steam engine, in order to preserve its inner order, needs to expel waste. That's how entropy goes to the wider environment. That's the entropic two-step at the level of a steam engine. It burns orderly fuel like logs. It does some useful work, but it has to emit some entropy, therefore some heat to the wider world. We're just like that. We don't eat logs, but we eat food. And we use that food, we burn it in order to carry out important bodily functions. But at the same time, we have got to emit entropy to the wider world in order to preserve our inner order, our inner structure. And we constantly are emitting heat and waste to the environment. And so we dance the entropic two-step for as long as we live. When we stop dancing the entropic two-step, that's when we have reached the end of our lives.
Okay.
In a way, we're gadgets. We're gadgets that the universe uses to transform some orderly entities and allow some disorder to be emitted to the wider world. We're a conduit for an entropy transfer in nature.
Yeah, I'm unsure whether to sort of find that really wondrous or feel like that's bringing us down to earth. But yeah,
both. I think.
I like that.
I think it's both because look, you know, how amazing it is that we can do what we do. And yet in the end of the day, we're nothing but living steam engines.
Yeah, well, just the complexity and the sophistication of the structures that arise purely from the interplay of these sort of physical forces is really inspiring. So I feel like we've done some good groundwork now. We've kind of been through these principles. And so next, we're moving on to consciousness. So we've got life, and at some point that those living steam engines become aware.
Yeah.
Why is consciousness such a tricky topic for science to get its head around?
It's tricky because there are two kinds of questions of a radically different sort that come into play when you talk about consciousness. One is, can we understand how a system can acquire complexity, allowing it to respond to the world in a wide variety of different ways? I mean, that's what conscious beings can do. Inanimate objects, they don't do very much. Conscious beings, they respond to the world in a wide variety of behaviors. That kind of question is not that difficult, even though it's a subtle one. We can imagine a process whereby we could come to an answer to that question, because ultimately you're talking about physical processes yielding physical behaviors. And that's the kind of arena in which science does a very good job. But there's a parallel question, which is the deeper question, which is often called the hard question of consciousness, which is why, in the process of undertaking, say, the computations necessary to determine what behavior you're going to respond to given some kind of stimulus, why is there a concurrent sensation? Why does thought turn into feeling? Why do we have an inner world in which we can feel and sense and have an inner voice inside our heads? Why do we see the color red inside of our brains? Why is there a sensation associated with the process of thought? And that is such a deep and subtle question, because if you think about it, if you are a physicalist, as I am, and you do believe that all we are collections of particles moving in an organized, choreographed manner, if those particles themselves, like electrons and quarks, if they don't have any inner worlds, and many of us think that they don't, how can a lot of them come together and turn the lights on? How can a lot of them come together and yield the inner world of common experience? And that hard problem is one that has continued to resist a convincing solution. There are solutions that people have put forward, but I would say there is as yet no consensus on how it is that we generate an inner world of experience from an outer world of particles that themselves don't have any inner qualities.
Does science and especially physics advance by making measurements, so gathering data and objective evidence? And of course our inner experience, most of us would feel like it isn't like that. We have feelings, the smell of coffee, the color of red, whatever it is, that we would feel you can't express that in a number. It's not an objective piece of data. So yeah. We shouldn't expect physics to be able to explain that? Are they two different things, or would you?
Well, I think you put your finger on a deep part of the puzzle. It is the case that our subjective experiences are subjective, right? In fact, none of us can even verify the claim that any of the other members of our species actually do have inner worlds, right? I mean, I think that you do. I think that my wife and my kids do, based on their behaviors and experiences, but I've never been inside their heads. They've never been inside my head. And therefore, I can't verify that the kind of world that takes place between my ears actually takes place between their ears. So that definitely changes the nature of the scientific question. As you're saying, we're used to objective third-party data. How does the moon move? How do the stars move? What kind of spectra comes out of that particular star, and so forth? Those are the kinds of things that anybody with the right equipment can ascertain the data and set about trying to explain the data. But when we're talking about inner worlds, I'm the only one that has access to my inner world. So how are you going to ever explain it? So you're right. Some would say that maybe this is beyond the realm of physics. And certainly famous thinkers going back to Descartes, they split up the world into the physical and the non-physical. And some would suggest that that split is one that we should still respect. Many scientists, and I count myself among them, do not think that that split is real. I think that split was useful for science. It was very useful for science let's put all the mental stuff to the side and concentrate on the things that we can actually have third-party objective measurements about. Newton set us on our way and we've been sailing ever since. Fantastic. But that doesn't mean that the inner world is fundamentally outside the realm of science. I do think that science will one day be able to understand conscious experience as the natural outcome of certain kind of collective particulate motions that in aggregate yield that kind of experience. We're not there yet, but I think that's where we're heading.
So rather than science having to develop sort of new approaches that are more subjective, you think the mathematics will be able to sort of reach into that realm and explain what's happening?
I would say yes, but I would also say that I think that the borderline between objective and subjective will shift over time. I think we'll be able to probe inner worlds in a way that perhaps today would be considered distasteful, deeply foreign, unfamiliar, but I think there will come a point where the difference between the inner world of subjective experience and the outer world of objective data, that will become far more blurry than it is today.
Well, you tell a story in a book about, well, sort of a theoretical story, I guess, about imagining a girl, I think, was it Mary, who was blind?
It's a famous story, yeah.
Yeah, and so, well, you can tell it better than me.
Well, there's a philosopher, Frank Jackson, a long time ago, who put forward a little thought experiment that has been kind of ricocheting throughout the philosophical community ever since, where he tried to make an argument, just a thought experiment, where he would try to argue that there has to be more to consciousness than the physical world can ever account for. And the way he made this argument is as follows. He said, look, imagine there's a girl named Mary. And my version of the story is that she's colorblind. She's never, ever seen any color ever, okay? And she just desperately wants to cure her color blindness. And what she does is she learns everything one could ever know about the brain, right? Anything that could know about the brain, every detailed molecular motion, every neurological connection. She goes so almost infinitely far beyond what science today has been able to achieve in its physical description of the brain. And with that, she is able to understand how to cure her color blindness. And she instructs the doctors what to do, and they cure her. Here's the question. The first day when they're taking off the bandages and she sees a red rose for the first time, she finally experiences color. Will she learn something new? Now, the stipulation was she already knew everything physical about the brain. And if that experience of color reveals something new, that would mean there's something about conscious experience, in this case of color, that transcends physical knowledge of the workings of the brain. Now, I think many of us, our intuition is when this woman sees red for the first time, of course she'll learn something new. Breathtaking experience of now seeing a color for the first time. And so our intuition, and this is what Frank Jackson was leveraging, our intuition is that, of course, she learned something new through that experience of color. And therefore, he wants to argue there is something beyond the physical in understanding conscious experience. And I think he convinced many people at first. Certainly when I first read that story, I was convinced. And I was knocked back on my heels for a few months. I was convinced that I was wrong in all my thinking that consciousness is nothing but physical processes. Here was an argument, a little story that established that there's something beyond it. Since then, however, many people, and again, I count myself in that group, have come to the conclusion that Mary may have a new experience. She may now be able to describe experiences in a different way because now she has a more direct access to, for instance, color. But she hasn't actually learned something new. She's only found new ways to describe old knowledge that she actually had through her complete articulation of the workings of the mind, workings of the brain. So this is a story, and it's still controversial. There are people who are convinced by Frank Jackson's original argument. In fact, Frank Jackson himself was no longer convinced of his original argument. He actually later in life flipped around. So it's an interesting story, but I think it ultimately is inconclusive as to whether consciousness is physical.
But I think it's so interesting in just making clear that distinction there. And I think I'm probably still at that point of having that instinctive feeling that yes, there would be something new. And I would love it if people watching could maybe put in the chat. I don't know if it'd be interesting to kind of get a spread of opinion of whether people think that there is something about experiencing red that would be new to Mary when she actually finally sees it for the first time.
And there are researchers who still, I mean, David Chalmers, you know, a famous philosopher, thinker about these ideas. He, as far as I can tell, based on one of his more recent books, is he's still convinced that that argument of Frank Jackson and the story of Mary does establish that there's something more to consciousness than physics and physical reasoning would ever reveal. So yes, that intuition and that response is completely understandable. And there's some who still argue that perspective strongly.
So he's written about a kind of sort of panpsychism, I guess, a sort of proto-consciousness that all particles are imbued with from the beginning. So we no longer have to explain how consciousness sort of popped out of nowhere, but it's just something that's been refined and evolved as our physical bodies have. And I guess he would say that that is all within the laws of physics. It doesn't go against any of the science that
totally. He would say, look, you know, if you're struggling to understand how mindless, thoughtless, emotionless particles can yield mind and thought and emotion, the answer is the particles are not mindless, thoughtless, emotionless. The particles themselves do have a little bit of thought, a little bit of mind, a little bit of emotion that he calls sort of a proto-conscious quality. And then he simply says, hey, when you have a lot of particles, their little bits of consciousness, their proto-conscious qualities aggregate and yield the conscious experience that large collections of particles inside a human brain can yield. And so, yes, his view is that he's tried every other solution to the problem of the hard problem of consciousness. And the only solution that he sees left standing is to change the nature of particles themselves. Look, that's a radical idea. I think it's really worthy of thinking about. And you're right, in principle, it doesn't step outside of physics. We simply have to say that the properties of particles, sure, their mass, we've spoken about that for a long time. Their electric charge, their weak nuclear charge, their strong nuclear, those we understand using the standard model of particle physics. And he would say there's something else that you need to add to the list of qualities of particles, this proto-conscious quality. And in principle, you might be able to quantify it with numbers. You might have equations that talk about that quality of particles. Nobody has these numbers or equations as yet, but that in principle is where that line of reasoning could lead.
So I guess there's no fundamental reason really why all of the properties that we choose to, you know, we measure the properties of particles that we can measure. And I guess there's no reason why there couldn't be other properties that we can't measure. Maybe
I'd even go further than that.
We weren't able to measure everything.
No, I totally agree with that. I'll go even further though, because if you ask me, what is mass? What is electric charge? I'm hard pressed to give you a fundamental answer to that very basic question. All I can do is I can say, I know how to measure those features, and I know how to determine what those features entail about the behavior of the particles. I know how massive particles behave compared to lighter particles. I know how particles with a lot of electric charge behave compared to particles that have less electric charge. And so I don't know what mass is. I don't know what charge is beyond that kind of description. And therefore, when it comes to this proto-conscious quality, maybe we won't ever be able to say what it really is. That may be forever beyond our reach, but maybe one day, according to David Chalmers and others who think this way, we'll be able to describe how proto-conscious qualities behave and how it is that when they come together, they yield this inner sensation of thought. That might be the best that we can ever do.
I can feel my neurons firing as we're talking about it. So with consciousness, you sort of admit some uncertainty, at least in terms of what our final explanation might be. But then you move on to free will, kind of even thornier issue perhaps. And you know, do we have control over our own actions and decisions? And there it seems like you sort of allow less uncertainty. You're quite stark about what you think physics means for the existence of free will.
Yeah, I mean, I do in the book, and when I speak about this, talk about it somewhat forcefully from a certain perspective. I do qualify my forceful articulation of my views on free will with the understanding that if David Chalmers' ideas perhaps are right, and consciousness is just completely different from our intuition about how it works. Perhaps that would have an impact. I don't even know that it would. But my view is indeed that we do not have the traditional intuitive notion of free will. The intuitive traditional notion is that we are the ultimate authors of our actions. We are where the buck truly stops when it comes to the decisions we make, the actions we take. And that idea is deeply incompatible with the understanding that we are large aggregates of particles governed by physical law. Every thought we take, every decision we make, ultimately, in the reductionist language, is nothing but our particles moving one way or another. And everything we know attests to the fact that we cannot intercede in that physical unfolding. We have no effect on that physical unfolding. That physical unfolding is fully determined by the initial conditions and the laws of physics. And therefore, the idea that we are ultimately where those behaviors, thoughts, decisions come from is deeply incompatible with all we know about the physical universe.
So this is quite a big thing that you're saying here, probably for most humans who are listening to that. The idea that we have absolutely no say in what's going on is going to be sort of counterintuitive and unpalatable, and probably against a lot of what a lot of people feel is, central to what it means to be human. So could you lay out a little bit more what gives you that confidence? What is it about the sort of the physics and the results that we've had that tells us that closes the door for this to be able to happen?
Well, I mean, the confidence, which again I need to emphasize, is mitigated by my full happiness to admit that since we don't fully understand what consciousness is, one has to be somewhat humble in one's statement. But under the assumption that consciousness is something that derives from the physical, that's the only assumption that I'm going to make. With that assumption, I am fully confident of the conclusion that I reach, because my 30, 40 years as a particle physicist, my recognition of what our forebears and our colleagues have done across centuries has all led to the view that the physical universe is lawful. Physical universe is lawful. That's all that one needs, because once you admit that the physical universe is lawful, it follows patterns that can be, say, at least in our era, articulated in the language of mathematics. Once you stipulate that, and everything we know points in that direction so fully, then there's no opportunity for any of us to intercede in that lawful progression. The laws don't chug along for some time and then say, oh, hang on, laws, wait for Brian to make a decision. Hang on, he hasn't yet decided. Wait, okay, he's decided now, laws take over and keep going from there. That's not how the universe as we understand it unfolds. The laws are always in control. The laws are never not in control. The laws have no opportunity for any other kind of influence that's not part of the lawful progression. And therefore, once you have that view and you realize that our brains, if under the assumption that consciousness is nothing but physics acting itself out on the particles of nature, there's no opportunity for us to have the kind of freedom that many of us intuitively think that we do.
And in the book, you go through also how even in a sort of quantum probabilistic system, like some people would say, is there sort of room for some nudging there? But you say, no, that's not the case.
Yeah, there's a long tradition of people looking to quantum mechanics as the source of human freedom. The idea being Newtonian classical physics has a certain kind of rigidity. Tell me how the world is now, and Newton tells you how it will be tomorrow. With that sort of rigid progression, it seems obvious that we don't have free will. There's no freedom in that story. Quantum mechanics comes along and says, well, hang on, that's not actually how the world works. Tell me how things are today, and I will tell you the probability of how they will be tomorrow. That's the quantum paradigm. And within that probability, there are now many possible outcomes. And so people say, aha, that's where freedom is. We choose which outcome of the many that are allowed by quantum mechanics. But that's nonsense. We don't pick it. it's certainly a probabilistic theory, but the progression is, again, fully determined, as far as we understand it, by the lawful qualities of the world. The fact that there's probabilities involved, that may at first sight give an opportunity, but when you think about it, it's completely irrelevant. If I told you that your behaviors were determined by a flip of a coin, would that make you feel better in terms of the control that you have? No. The fact that it's probabilistic doesn't add anything to it, because you are not involved in the decision of what transpires. And you can't be, because if you did have that kind of role, the probabilistic predictions of quantum mechanics would not agree with the data. So probabilities might at first sight seem to open the door, but when you think about it more fully, you can shut that door really tightly.
So I'm going to keep looking for a little bit of wiggle room here. So this is probably a stupid question, but presumably all the physics experiments are done on inanimate matter. Like, do we know whether all of those predictions would still hold true on a conscious brain? You know, because you have, you talked about the entropic two-step at the beginning. Yeah. Did you have a sort of quantum two-step where you can nudge a probability here and get something back over there? You're absolutely right. That is a great question to ask, because it is not the case that we can make the kinds of predictions that we make for individual electrons or hydrogen atoms, where we can test those predictions to fantastic accuracy. Nobody can do those kinds of calculations for a living system. I can't calculate what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow and then compare it, or the probability of what you're going to have for breakfast tomorrow, and then compare it with actually the data, because the computations are too complex. They're too difficult. And so you might say maybe somewhere in there, that's where freedom emerges. And it's not that I can come with an airtight argument where I can show you the data establishing that that view is incorrect, but I can rely upon a few hundred years of experiment that seems to deeply suggest that having large collections of particles may make the calculations more difficult, but it doesn't introduce anything new. There are no physical laws that somehow come to bear that were not relevant when you're talking about the basic ingredients themselves. So I can't give you a slam dunk argument, but I can say that there's nothing that we've ever found, and everything that we have found points to the conclusion that I'm describing. Could it be wrong? Yes, it could be wrong, but nothing even remotely suggests from our understanding of the physical universe that that's the case. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, fortunately, you have a different kind of freedom to offer us. Yeah, I'm glad you bring that up, because I do feel strongly that we're too attached to the kind of freedom that our intuition suggests that we have. I believe that the reason we have this intuition, that we are the ultimate authors, we're the place where the decisions really happen, from an evolutionary perspective, that must have provided us a leg up on the competition. And therefore, this way of thinking about the world became ingrained in our perspective on reality. But we all know that there are many things that are in our intuition that are deeply wrong. I think that this table is solid in front of me, but we know that's not solid. Quantum mechanics and our understanding of the world allows us to recognize that it's mostly empty space. So intuition can be deeply misleading. There's another version of human freedom that deviates from our intuition that I think is really worthy of focusing upon, which is this. How do we differ from the kinds of things that we don't feel have free will? How do we differ from, say, a rock? Well, we differ because our internal organization that comes from evolution by natural selection is so much more sophisticated than the internal organization of a rock. And that allows us to do things that simply are not available to the rock. A rock just sits there. You look at it, you touch it, you talk to it. It doesn't do anything. You kick it, it rolls, and it doesn't do something someplace else. We can do so much. We can respond with such a wide behavioral repertoire that is intrinsic to what it means to be a human being. See, our freedom, in my view, is not to transcend physical law. We don't have that freedom. Nothing does. Our freedom instead is to be liberated from the constrained behavior that has long since governed the inanimate world of rocks and other inanimate structures. That's what we should focus upon.
And that wide behavioral repertoire is responsible for everything that we as a species have done. That's our freedom. And that's the freedom that we actually have. And that's the freedom we should focus upon.
And you go on in the next few chapters of the book to sort of explore what that freedom has unleashed and enabled us to achieve. First of all, stories. You're very attached to stories. Could you say a little bit about why stories are important to us, and why do we tell fictional stories?
Yes, so you're absolutely right. You know, once we realize that we have this kind of freedom, this wide range of behaviors and wide range of thoughts and wide range of responses, you then are naturally led to wonder, is there some pattern in those behaviors? And one of the dominant patterns that we have learned from looking at our evolutionary past is that since the earliest days, we have told stories, we have concocted narratives. And the reason for this, again, is somewhat controversial, but the explanation that I find most pleasing and most satisfying is one that comes again from evolution, but it comes from evolutionary psychologists who have realized that our behaviors, not just our physical form, but our behaviors to some extent, you can overdo it, and they often caution, don't go too far with this kind of reasoning, but our behaviors have been governed by survival in the ancestral world. Those behaviors that allowed us to cope with the challenges of the past are the kinds of behaviors that became intrinsic to our molecular makeup. And among those behaviors is storytelling, because storytelling allows us in a very safe way to experience things that if we were actually to experience in the real world could be quite dangerous. And that then prepares us as a species and as individuals for challenges in the world without having to suffer the danger of encountering those challenges in a firsthand manner. We can imagine them, we can think them through, we can imagine battles. We can imagine challenging encounters with wild animals. We can imagine very dangerous situations. And by thinking them through, when we actually happen to encounter those situations, can deal with them in a far better manner than we otherwise would have. It's an explanation that some have called
like
kind of
conflict and resolution in our stories.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. It's kind of like a flight simulator of the mind. I mean, how does a pilot train to fly? They have these flight simulators. Why? You don't want to send the pilot out there into the thunderstorm before they've actually experienced it in a safe way. Similarly, stories are the flight simulator of the mind, allowing us to experience those things that would be dangerous to encounter for the first time. But by training through story, we can deal with them in a far more effective manner.
And then we have mythical and religious stories. And you seem, for a reductionist, a bit more accepting of religion than a lot of scientists might be. So could you say a bit about what you would see as the value of religion?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, look, it's many of my colleagues, many of them well known, no doubt, to the audience that's listening to this conversation, would be all too happy to simply see religion go away, to see it wiped off the face of the earth. And I don't see it that way at all. I see religion as the natural outgrowth of the storytelling instinct that has been with us from way back when, allowing those stories to cope with, as we started off in this conversation, one of the most devastating recognitions that we as a species have had, which is we're mortal. We're all going to die. Our presence on this earth is finite. And I think it was Stephen Jay Gould who said all religions begin with an awareness of death. In one way or another, the world's religions exist to help human beings cope with this deep recognition of our own mortality. And it's certainly the case that as society and as science develops further, thinking of religion as an explanation for things in the external, objectively available data, that will be an ever poorer guide to understanding the world. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that The world was created in 7 days. Science is the tool that we should use for understanding the origin of the earth and the origin of the cosmos and so forth. But religion can, for some, be a powerful and poetic tool for understanding their own inner world, their own coping mechanism for navigating a world in which they know that their own presence will be finite. And William James, great American scientist, psychologist back in early 1900s, he wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And I think every human being who thinks about these things should read, because his point in that book, at least in part, was to recognize the different ways that people have religion as part of their worldview, and to recognize that if your only knowledge of the world comes from science describing this external environment that we are immersed within, you can lose the poetry of inner experience. And that poetry of inner experience for many is deeply entwined with a spiritual sense, a religious sense. And so to try to eliminate that would be to eliminate a vital part of the human story.
And you talk in the book quite movingly about when your father died and how you found certain traditions, religious traditions, comforting then. And you talked about the history and the connection and the heritage that comes with some of these practices.
Yeah, I think that's a deep part of it too. I mean, many of the world's religions, and I emphasize this in the book, the obvious fact is many of them are old. And that venerable quality allows us in the modern era to feel connected to a long lineage of individuals in our past that had to cope with the same kinds of very human, all too human challenges that we do. And yeah, when my dad died, I'm not religious. I don't go to temple. I don't follow any of the rituals in a yearly, annual manner. But when my dad died, a minion of observant Jews came to our apartment and they cited the Kaddish prayer. And I had no idea what it meant, but it was deeply comforting. It was deeply comforting because I felt like I was being embraced by a 5,000-year-old tradition that had coped with this all too natural and all too real part of human experience. So it didn't change my scientific outlook, but it did enrich my inner life and my inner capacity to deal with one of life's passages.
And then it's on to art. So what are some of the ideas around how art may have arisen? And I'm really hoping that you're going to mention cheesecake.
I'm sorry, what was the cheesecake?
I'm really hoping you're going to mention cheesecake.
Yeah, well, again, it's a controversial subject, which all these are, which is what makes this whole journey, I think, that much more interesting. But there are some who argue, and I feel strongly that this is a worthy explanation of where our artistic practices come from. Art is a kind of playground of the mind. I mean, ethologists have long known that animals engage in play in order that they then can deal with the challenges of their environment more effectively. So play fighting and play battles allow them, when they encounter the real ones, to do better, and therefore it has an evolutionary role. Art, in many ways, can be viewed as a playground of the mind, where the mind is given free rein to go beyond the constraints of the physical world, to imagine things that are not realizable in the real world, allowing a kind of ingenuity and experimentation and innovative exploration to be part of how we engage with the challenges that we encounter. And I full well believe that that all too human quality is what helped us to prevail. I mean, if there were another species, another humanoid species that didn't practice art, was not interested, that's a waste of time. Why would I spend my time sculpting or painting or composing when I can get more fruit and vegetables, when I can sharpen more spears to get more deer and antelope? Of course, I should do that, one would think. But I think that that version, that humanoid species, would not prevail against us. Because when we encounter challenges that require creativity, require ingenuity. It's our willingness to go beyond the obvious things in the world around us, the choices that would seemingly be the right ones. It's our willingness to go against that grain that has allowed us to prevail. And that ultimately, I and many others think, is the origin of why we compose, why we sing, why we dance, why we paint, why we sculpt, from cave paintings to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony.
It's almost like blue skies research, that you have to just be going out there and asking questions and being creative, and not...
That is a version of the same story. Many people look at science as something that is all about just following a certain set of prescribed rules. The scientific method is often what we teach kids, and sure, there's something to that, but every time I hear about the scientific method, it makes my heart sink, because we scientists, we don't practice the scientific method in any rigid formulation. We allow our creative imaginings to take us to unexpected places, and 99% of the time it's wrong. It's not relevant to what we're doing, but 1% maybe it's right. And that's what gives rise to Einstein's general relativity. That's what gives rise to quantum mechanics, the ability for the mind to go to these unexpected places that an algorithm like the scientific method would never suggest.
Yeah, you said that was it Einstein who said that he thought in music. So
that was his own description. Yeah, he said he rarely thinks in words. He often thinks in music. What a beautiful idea that is, that he's just composing these melodies that ultimately are articulated in a mathematical language.
So we might have to come back to the cheesecake in the Q&A, because
yeah, right.
I want to just move on to what was one of my favorite bits of the book. Well, there were lots, but you talk about experiences, some of them artistic, but other kinds of experiences as well, that you said sort of can't be put into words, that kind of had a meaning that was beyond words, and perhaps were meaningful almost because they couldn't be explained rationally or logically. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, articulation, language emerged for a particular purpose. Again, even that's controversial. I describe some of the ideas in the book as well. But ideas of Daniel Dorr have had a deep influence on me, that language is developed in order that an individual can guide the imagination of another individual, allow them to experience things through words that they themselves have never experienced in the real world. You can see there's a lot of advantage for groups of individuals to be able to do that with each other. But language itself, therefore, was selected for a very specific kind of purpose. And we have broadened out that purpose quite widely. But why would one think that all human experience would naturally be something that could be described in this one particular mode, that could be absorbed through this one particular mode of spoken or written language? And I don't think that spoken or written language does exhaust the capacities of human experience. And I certainly have had experiences, and I describe some in the book, that I don't try to put into words. I don't know how to put them into words, and I wouldn't attempt to put them into words because I'm not looking for that mode of description. There are some things that one has an experience of in the world. For me, it was at times on a mountaintop with a survival course that I was on, seeing the northern lights. Another experience that I describe in the book is one in which I accidentally ran over a dog with a car, and I was with that dog in its final moments. These kinds of experiences and a wealth of others, for me, I feel them, I grasp them, I understand them, I've integrated them into my worldview, but I consider them beyond language.
It does seem a really interesting tension, because you have this reductionist approach and everything is particles and forces. And yet here you're saying there are these experiences that can't be explained rationally, but they have a meaning that is...
That's right, because...
Almost, so you...
Good. Well, you see, because language and rationality I see as physical phenomena that are carried out by this particular kind of collection of particles. Why would one think that this particular collection of particles and what it can do and the modes by which it communicates, why would that be exhaustive? It's not. And therefore, this collection of particles can take in experiences and process experiences in a manner that's parallel to the rational, parallel to the articulable, parallel to the narratable, but not necessarily subsumed by those qualities. And therefore you can feel something without having to articulate it.
So what about mathematics then? Would we expect mathematics to be exhaustive?
Yeah, I do. I do think, well, see, I view mathematics, and I've gone back and forth on this over the course of my own career and life, but I, for a long time now, have stabilized on thinking of math as a language. The old question, is math invented or discovered? You know, to me, I think that math is invented. We encounter patterns in the world, and we invented a language called mathematics, which is really good at describing those patterns and using those patterns to make predictions for other patterns that we should henceforth see. But to me, math is just a language of human invention and therefore has its own limitations.
Okay, well, we had better move on in time and start getting towards the future, because we are running out of our own time. So yeah, you move on like way beyond humanity, beyond the, you know, our species, beyond the planet, to look incredibly far in the future at what we can say about what might happen. And you have this wonderful metaphor of the Empire State Building. So I wondered if you could just explain that and tell us a little bit about what might happen as we go forwards in time.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, as you say, you know, the narrative arc of the book is to start at the beginning, the Big Bang, find the organizing principles that give rise to complex structures like human beings, that give rise to conscious experience, that give rise to language, that give rise to religion, give rise to art. But then I pivot from today and use those principles to look arbitrarily far into the future. And this Empire State Building metaphor, I think is a nice one. What I do is I say, imagine that each floor of the Empire State Building represents a duration 10 times that of the previous floor. So the ground floor, 1 year, next floor, 10, next floor, 100, and so forth. So it's kind of exponential scale up the floors of the Empire State Building. And in that approach, everything from the Big Bang until today takes us to just about the 10th floor. But the Empire State Building goes up to 102 floors. And I take the reader, in some sense, floor by floor. We don't stop at every floor, thankfully, but we go floor by floor to see what the universe will be like exponentially far into the future. And we can hit some highlights if you want, if that would be a useful thing to do.
Yes, please.
Sure. So, you know, we all know that the sun is going to swell and engulf the inner planets. That's relatively soon on these scales. That's sort of between floor 10 and 11. By floor 12, the ever quickening expansion of space will drive distant galaxies away faster than the speed of light. And so we'll be floating in a sea of darkness by the 12th floor. By the 14th floor, most stars use up their nuclear fuel. They fade to black. By floor 20, if the Earth wasn't swallowed up by the swelling sun back around floor 11, it will now spiral into the dead sun, having lost energy through gravitational radiation. By floor 30, most stars fall into the galaxy's central black hole. By floor 38, we believe it's likely that protons, the heart of matter, they will likely disintegrate. So all material structure will disintegrate into a bath of particles. And then roughly speaking, between floor 68 and the peak, black holes themselves will evaporate. Stephen Hawking taught us that they give off a gentle kind of radiation that increases in intensity during the duration of their lives. And ultimately, they give off all of their mass through this radiation. And so by about the peak of the Empire State Building, the only thing left is a quiet bath of particles floating through the darkness. That's a rough summary from here until eternity.
So you take us all the way to oblivion, and there are some kind of weird and wonderful exceptions that we don't have time right now to go into detail in, but people have to read the book for that. But yeah, so we're in oblivion, darkness, nothing, everything's gone. Like, it's not just us, it's individuals, the species is gone, the planet's gone, basically every structure in the universe has gone, thought has gone.
Yes.
So how did you respond to this knowledge, and how have you sort of dealt with that and found meaning in that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when I first encountered these ideas, which it was over a long period of time. Physicists tend not to focus on the story that we've been telling here. They tend to focus on one era or another. They don't usually look at the whole thing. When I first encountered these ideas, I found it deeply disquieting. Definitely sent me into a dark place for a little while. This idea that everything we care about is going to disintegrate. Everything that we think matters in the grand scheme of things will dissolve away. But over time, I've come to a different place with these ideas, a recognition of how utterly wondrous it is that collections of particles governed by the physical laws can somehow come together and yield conscious beings capable of doing what we're doing, capable of thought and reflection, capable of illuminating mystery as we have done, capable of creating beauty, which we have certainly done, capable of experiencing wonder. And when you have that recognition and you deeply take it in, my experience has been that it yields a sense of gratitude and a sense of reverence for being here at all. And that deep gratitude and reverence is not diminished by the fact that it all dissolves. It's a gratitude and reverence that persists however fleeting human experience may be.